Hello, this is Kevin Benedict, Independent Mobility Analyst, reporting live from Rotterdam here at the Enterprise Mobility Exchange 2012. I have the good fortune of having cornered Nick McQuire from IDC, who's Director of Mobility here in, you focus on Europe, don't you, Nick?
I've got an EMEA role, yeah.
Perfect. Now, I just listened to a presentation. You covered a lot of really interesting numbers, trends, everything else. But one of the things is kind of a recurring theme out there is how do you support bring your own device, BYOD? So let me take it a step further and just ask you, Nick, is there a difference between regional support of BYOD or a multinational company's international view? How's that different? And what are the challenges from a country by country to an international view?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's what many global organizations are struggling with. I mean, there are some global organizations like Shell and Dell, for example, Johnson & Johnson. Some of these guys have done BYOD in a multi-country environment. But many global companies that are really looking at it have to appreciate that it takes a lot of time to implement largely the governance and policy programs that wrap around BYOD. In terms of doing that efficiently across the base. And if you look at many companies in terms of what they're struggling to do, I think the technology side to deploy it, I think that's fairly straightforward. Most organizations can do that pretty quickly, but it's kind of getting the governance piece in place is something that takes a lot of conversations locally with countries and having to navigate compliance and legal requirements that are in country. Having to operate certainly sometimes in certain countries with local governments as well, and having to navigate in certain countries as well the requirement that data can't leave the country makes it quite difficult for organizations to implement pan-regional BYOD frameworks. So I think that's what many organizations are struggling with around BYOD at this stage. I think also there's probably a little bit of more of a conservatism outside of the U.S. around the demand for BYOD amongst users as well. And so that's also contributing to the fact that whilst a lot of noise is happening around BYOD in the U.S., outside the U.S. and EMEA and other countries, it's taking root, but it's taking root in a much slower fashion.
Yeah, what I was so impressed with yesterday in some of the discussions is how the cultural issues that come up and the legal issues, country by country, where some organizations and some cultures just do not want to be held accountable for any kind of activity outside the four walls.
Correct.
And so they sabotage areas even. Yeah. We had some discussions yesterday where there's no compliance to the processes. You can't use location-based services. You can't coordinate, least cost routing or any of that kind of stuff because of some of the regulations.
Yeah, and it's funny how cultural translate to the leveraging specific legal and compliance issues as well to say no to BYOD. So typically what's happening is organizations, they're rolling out BYOD, but it's an opt-in, okay, and so they let users decide as to whether or not they do it. And the trade-off is, of course, that there are conditions to that, and it's up to the employee to decide, as to how far they want to accept those trade-offs, right? And it's up to the organization to make sure that those trade-offs are in place in the policy program, and certainly in terms of the education as well to users, to ensure that they are compliant on that side. So it's interesting. You talk to some organizations that have done it, in countries like Russia and China, where obviously there's an obligation to go through a state security apparatus for encrypting information on the device. In Germany, you can't. IT have really strong restrictions around seeing personal information on a device. In addition to the fact that data can't leave the country there. So companies that have implemented BYOD, they've got around some of these countries, but it's taken them a bit of time. One company told me that they deployed the technology in 2 to 3 months, but it took them 16 months to implement the governance. So I think that's the deal. And so organizations that do it, they have to do it in a measured way. Possibly they do it, in a way in which they have some centralized rules of the game, based around the policy, and it's up to the local outfits to implement those rules of the game as addendums, that are subjective to those particular local countries, and of course let employees decide. So that's typically what I've seen organizations do today.
Great. Well, Nick, I want to thank you so much for sharing with the audience today. Nick McQuire with IDC.
Thanks very much, Kevin. Thanks for having me.